Sometimes the sentence that ends a marriage sounds so casual that you almost miss it. Those words did not make sense to me until 3 days before Christmas, when my wife looked up from her phone, barely making eye contact, and said, "I'm spending Christmas with my ex's family. You can stay with yours." She delivered it the same way someone might mention stopping at the grocery store on the way home. No hesitation. No apology. No explanation. Just a simple announcement, as if the decision had already been approved by everyone who mattered. For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. Olivia had always enjoyed dry humor, and over the 6 years we had been married, she occasionally tested my reactions with strange comments. I waited for the smile that never came. Instead, she continued scrolling through her messages, her expression calm and almost relieved, like she had finally crossed something off her list. The Christmas tree stood in the corner of our living room, decorated with ornaments we had collected from every vacation we had taken together. White lights reflected against the windows while soft holiday music played from the speaker in the kitchen. Everything around us looked like the picture of a happy home, yet I suddenly felt like a guest standing inside someone else's life. "You're serious?" I asked quietly. Olivia finally looked at me and shrugged. "His parents invited me weeks ago. They've always treated me like family. You'll be fine. Besides, your parents will probably be happy to have you for Christmas." There was something almost rehearsed about her answer. She did not sound angry. She did not sound guilty. She sounded convinced that what she was doing was perfectly reasonable. I searched her face for some hint that she understood how strange those words were, but I found nothing except confidence. I could have argued. I could have reminded her that Christmas had always been our holiday together, that my mother had already bought presents with both our names on them, that married couples usually spent Christmas with each other before anyone else. Instead, I noticed something unexpected happening inside me. The disappointment arrived first. But it was quickly replaced by a strange calm. It was the kind of calm that appears after months of carrying a weight you no longer realize is crushing your shoulders. I took a slow breath, nodded once, and smiled politely. "Have fun," I said. Olivia blinked, clearly expecting resistance. "That's it?" she asked. "That's it." She stared at me for another moment, almost disappointed that I had not raised my voice or demanded an explanation. Then she simply nodded and returned to her phone. I walked upstairs, closed the bedroom door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence inside that room felt louder than any argument we could have had downstairs. For months I had convinced myself that small disappointments were simply part of marriage. The cancelled dinners. The forgotten anniversaries. The conversations that somehow always ended with my feelings becoming an inconvenience. I kept believing that if I stayed patient long enough, things would return to the way they used to be. But as I sat there looking at the wrapped Christmas gifts waiting in the closet, I realized something I had refused to admit for a very long time. My wife had not just chosen another family for Christmas. She had chosen a life where I no longer came first. And for the first time since the day we said our wedding vows, I stopped asking myself how to save our marriage. Instead, I found myself wondering what my life might finally look like if I stopped fighting to be someone's second choice. The next morning the house felt strangely peaceful. Olivia moved around the kitchen humming along with a Christmas playlist while packing an overnight bag, as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. She asked whether I wanted coffee, and I politely declined. The conversation never returned to her plans because, at least from her perspective, the subject had already been settled. I watched her zip her suitcase and carefully fold a sweater that I had once given her for Christmas. It was strange how ordinary everything looked. If someone had walked into our home that morning, they would have seen a successful married couple preparing for the holidays. They never would have guessed that. Something invisible had already broken between us. Around noon she picked up her phone and smiled at a new message. A few seconds later she laughed softly before typing a reply. I recognized that smile. It had almost disappeared from our marriage over the past year, yet somehow it returned so easily now. She glanced toward me. "They are excited that I am coming early. We are going to decorate cookies before dinner." I simply nodded. Sounds like they have a full day planned. She looked disappointed by my calm response again, almost as if she wanted me to challenge her decision. Instead, I helped carry her suitcase to the front door. She hesitated before stepping outside. You really are not upset? She asked. I answered honestly. I was. Now I am just thinking. She studied my face for a long moment, but apparently found nothing she could argue with. Well, Merry Christmas, Daniel. Merry Christmas, Olivia. She drove away without looking back. I stood on the porch until her car disappeared around the corner, not because I hoped she would return, but because I realized that I felt lighter than I had in months. Inside the house the silence returned, yet this time it did not feel empty. It felt honest. I walked through every room noticing little things I had ignored for too long. The unfinished conversations. The unopened board game we bought last Christmas but never played together. The framed wedding photo where we looked at each other with complete certainty about our future. I wondered when certainty had quietly become obligation. My phone buzzed several times during the afternoon. First, my mother called to ask what time we would arrive for Christmas Eve dinner. I gently explained that I would be coming alone. There was a long pause before she simply said, "Come home, son. That is all that matters." She did not ask for details. She never needed to. Later, one of Olivia's friends posted a group picture online. Olivia stood beside several familiar faces from her past, smiling brightly beneath Christmas lights. Someone had written, "Just like old times." Hundreds of people would probably scroll past that picture without thinking twice. I stared at those 4 words much longer than I should have. Just like old times. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. She was celebrating a version of her life that existed before me while I was still trying to protect the one we had promised each other. Instead of feeling angry, I quietly closed the application, packed a single duffel bag, placed the wrapped gifts for my parents in the trunk of my car, and started the 3-hour drive toward the small town where I had grown up. Snowflakes drifted across the windshield while familiar Christmas songs played through the speakers. Somewhere along that highway I stopped wondering whether Olivia would eventually realize what she was risking. For the first time in years, my thoughts turned toward a different question entirely. If I could build a future without constantly asking someone else to choose me, what kind of man could I finally become? By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the porch was glowing with warm white lights that my father insisted on hanging himself every December, even though he always complained about climbing the ladder afterward. My mother opened the front door before I even reached the steps. She wrapped her arms around me without asking why I had come alone. That was one thing I had always admired about her. She knew the difference between curiosity and compassion. My father shook my hand, pulled me into a hug, and smiled. "You made it home. That is what matters." Inside, the smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh bread filled every room. My younger sister Emily was already setting the table, while her 2 children raced through the hallway wearing matching Christmas pajamas. The house was loud and perfect, and full of genuine laughter. I had forgotten how comforting that sounded. During dinner nobody forced me to explain my marriage. Instead, we talked about old family stories, neighborhood memories, and the embarrassing Christmas when I accidentally knocked over the tree at 10 years old. For the first time in months, I laughed without pretending. After everyone finished eating, my father asked if I wanted to help him carry a few storage boxes from the garage. We stepped outside into the cold evening, and as we organized old decorations, he quietly said, "You know, son, when people stop appreciating peace, they usually mistake it for weakness." I looked at him without speaking. He continued placing ornaments into a plastic container. "Your grandfather used to tell me that the strongest people rarely make the most noise. They simply know when it is time to stop chasing someone who keeps walking away." Those words stayed with me long after we returned inside. Later that night, while everyone watched an old Christmas movie, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed the name of Richard Lawson, the founder of the consulting firm where I had spent nearly 8 years building corporate turnaround strategies. I stepped onto the back porch before answering. Richard rarely called outside business hours, especially on Christmas Eve. "Daniel," he said, his voice carrying unusual excitement, "I hope I am not interrupting your holiday." "Not at all." He laughed softly. "Good. Because I have been trying to reach you since yesterday. The board voted this afternoon. They accepted your restructuring proposal exactly as you presented it." I closed my eyes for a moment. That proposal represented almost 18 months of work, countless flights, late nights, and weekends spent studying financial reports instead of relaxing at home. Olivia knew I had been working on an important project, but I had never shared the details because nothing had been finalized. I did not want to celebrate something that might never happen. Richard continued, "There is more. They want you to lead the national expansion yourself. It comes with a significant ownership package, a new executive position, and complete authority to build your own division. Congratulations, Daniel. You earned every bit of it." Snow drifted silently across the backyard while I listened to the numbers he described. The opportunity would change my future completely, not because of the salary, but because it meant years of work had finally been recognized. After we finished talking, I slipped my phone into my coat pocket and looked through the kitchen window. My family was gathered around the table, decorating gingerbread cookies with the children, laughing over uneven frosting and crooked candy canes. Nobody in that room knew my life had just changed forever. And strangely, I realized I did not need anyone to applaud the moment. For years I had quietly carried responsibilities, hopes, and dreams without demanding recognition. Tonight that silence no longer felt lonely. It felt powerful. As I walked back inside, my mother handed me a cookie decorated with far too much icing and smiled. "Come sit down, Daniel. Christmas is not about perfect plans. It is about the people who are happy you showed up." For the first time in a very long time, I believed her. Christmas morning arrived beneath a sky covered with soft gray clouds, and while my parents' house echoed with the familiar chaos of children opening presents and adults pretending to be surprised by gifts they had secretly requested, Olivia woke up in a very different kind of home. She had imagined laughter, comfort, and the feeling of returning to something familiar, but almost immediately she noticed that memories and reality were not the same thing. Mark's parents welcomed her politely, but the warmth she remembered from years ago had faded into simple courtesy. She was no longer the young woman they once believed would become part of their family. She was now a married guest visiting during the holidays, and everyone seemed careful not to forget that fact. Mark tried to keep the mood light by telling old stories from college, yet each joke felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Olivia smiled at the right moments, but she found herself forcing every laugh. During breakfast she instinctively reached for her phone, expecting to see a message from me. There was nothing. She checked again 15 minutes later. Still nothing. That surprised her more than she wanted to admit. Every disagreement we had ever experienced had ended with me trying to fix things first. Even when I believed I was right, I usually reached out because I hated letting conflict grow. This time there was only silence. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling settling in her chest. Later that afternoon, several relatives arrived carrying gifts and homemade desserts. Introductions became awkward almost immediately. One elderly aunt smiled kindly before asking, "So how is your husband spending Christmas?" Olivia hesitated for a second before answering, "He is with his family." The woman nodded politely, but the conversation stopped there. Another guest quietly changed the subject, and Olivia suddenly realized everyone in the room understood how unusual her visit really was. Nobody criticized her. Nobody embarrassed her. Their kindness somehow made the situation feel even more uncomfortable. As the afternoon continued, Mark became increasingly distracted, helping his father fix outdoor decorations, carrying boxes from the garage, and answering calls from his coworkers. Olivia spent several minutes sitting alone beside the fireplace while conversations naturally formed around families, marriages, and future plans. She listened as one couple discussed taking their children to see Christmas lights the following weekend. Another family laughed about traditions they had kept alive for 3 generations. Without warning, she found herself thinking about the ornaments hanging on the tree in our living room and the way I always insisted on making hot chocolate from scratch instead of using instant packets. Those little habits had once seemed ordinary. Now they felt strangely valuable. During dinner, Mark's mother gently asked whether I had minded her accepting the invitation. Olivia quickly answered. He understood. Even as the words left her mouth, she remembered my expression when I had simply said, "Have fun." There had been no anger in my voice, no pleading, no disappointment that she could use to reassure herself that I would always be waiting. There had only been calm. For the first time, she wondered if she had misunderstood that calm completely. After dessert, everyone gathered in the family room for pictures. Mark stood beside his parents while siblings, cousins, and grandchildren naturally arranged themselves around one another. Olivia smiled when someone handed her a place near the end of the group, but as the camera flashed, she realized she did not belong in the photograph the way everyone else did. She was included, yet not rooted. Present, yet temporary. That evening, after returning to the guest room, she unlocked her phone again. She opened our message thread and stared at the last words I had sent before she left. There were only 2. Have fun. She read them over and over until they no longer sounded dismissive. Instead, they felt like the quiet closing of a door she had never imagined could actually be shut. The day after Christmas, I woke before sunrise, something I had not done voluntarily in months. My parents' house was still quiet, and the only sound came from the coffee maker my father programmed every night before bed. I poured myself a cup, stepped onto the back porch, and watched fresh snow settle across the empty fields behind the house. For the first time in years, there was nothing demanding my immediate attention. No tense conversation waiting at breakfast. No careful effort to keep the peace. No feeling that I needed to earn my place in my own marriage. My phone vibrated just after 7 o'clock. It was Richard again. "I know it is the holidays," he said, "but I wanted to let you know the board wants to announce your appointment right after New Year's Day. Human Resources will prepare everything this week. You will also be selecting your own leadership team." I thanked him, and before ending the call he added one more sentence that stayed with me. "Daniel, you have spent years helping other companies rebuild. It is finally your turn to build something for yourself." After breakfast, my father invited me to take a walk through the neighborhood. We passed the little park where he had taught me to throw a baseball and the diner where my parents had gone on their first date more than 35 years earlier. Nothing about the town had become more impressive over time, yet everything felt more valuable because the people here never made me question whether I belong. As we walked, my father glanced toward me. "Have you decided what you are going to do?" I knew exactly what he meant. "Not completely," I admitted. "But I know I cannot pretend everything is normal anymore." He nodded without offering advice. "Sometimes the hardest decision is simply accepting that something has already changed." That afternoon I received several congratulatory messages from coworkers who had quietly learned about the promotion through internal conversations. One colleague wrote that everyone expected I would eventually become an executive because I was the person people trusted when difficult problems appeared. Reading those words made me smile, not because of the title, but because I suddenly realized something uncomfortable. Complete strangers had seen value in me long before I had started seeing it in myself. Meanwhile, Olivia spent another day with people who continued treating her politely, but she increasingly noticed how every conversation naturally circled back to shared memories that no longer included her. Mark discussed future travel plans with his siblings. His parents talked about retirement. Family photographs covered every wall, telling a story that had continued moving forward without her. She smiled through every conversation, yet she caught herself checking her phone whenever nobody was looking. There were still no new messages from me. She finally opened one of my social media accounts and found a photograph Emily had posted earlier that afternoon. It showed me sitting beside my parents, laughing while my niece proudly held up the gingerbread house we had built together. The caption read, "Exactly where family belongs during Christmas." There was nothing dramatic about the picture. No expensive gifts, No luxury vacation. Just genuine happiness. Olivia stared at the image much longer than she expected. She enlarged it twice before setting the phone down beside her. An uneasy thought quietly entered her mind. While she had been trying to revisit a chapter that ended years ago, I had somehow started writing an entirely new one without asking her to be part of it. Hundreds of miles away, I sat with my mother in the living room helping her organize old family photo albums. She laughed as we found faded pictures from birthdays, graduations, and camping trips, and I realized every meaningful memory in front of me had one thing in common. None of them had been built by chasing people who questioned my worth. They had been built by those who never did. 2 days after Christmas, Olivia packed her suitcase much earlier than anyone expected. Mark's mother thanked her warmly for visiting and handed her a small tin of homemade cookies for the drive home. Mark offered to carry her luggage to the car, and as they stood outside beneath the cold winter sky, he smiled politely before saying something she had not expected to hear. "I am glad we caught up, Olivia. It was nice remembering the old days." She nodded with a faint smile. "Maybe we can all do this again sometime." Mark hesitated before answering. "Maybe. But honestly, I think memories are supposed to stay where they belong. They are good to visit once in a while, but they are not a place to live." His words were gentle, yet they followed her the entire drive home. During the 3-hour trip, she reached for her phone more than once, thinking about calling me, but every time she opened my contact, she closed it again. She could not explain why. Perhaps she expected that I would eventually call first, the way I always had before. When she finally pulled into our driveway that evening, she noticed my car was already parked in the garage. A strange mixture of relief and nervousness settled over her. She walked inside carrying her suitcase, expecting the familiar silence of our house after the holidays. Instead, she found neatly stacked moving boxes along one wall of my home office. The room itself looked different. Shelves had been cleared. Old files were organized into labeled containers. My desk held only a laptop and several folders. I was sitting there reviewing documents when she quietly knocked on the open door. "You are back," I said calmly. "I am." She waited for more words, but none came. Finally she asked, "What are all these boxes?" I closed the folder in front of me. "I accepted a new executive position. I will be leading a national division starting next month. There will be a lot of changes." Olivia stared at me in surprise. "You never told me. Nothing was official before Christmas." She slowly walked into the room. "A national division? Daniel, that is incredible." I smiled politely. "Thank you." The conversation felt strangely formal, almost like two coworkers discussing business instead of a married couple sharing life together. She looked around the office again. "Is that why you have been so busy these past months?" I nodded. "Yes. Most weekends I was finishing the proposal that made all this possible." She lowered her eyes for a moment. Suddenly dozens of memories returned to her. The nights she complained that I worked too much. The dinners she attended without me because I stayed home preparing presentations. The times she accused me of caring more about spreadsheets than about our marriage. She had never once asked what I was actually building. Before she could say anything else, my phone rang. Richard's name appeared on the screen. I answered using the speaker because I was still organizing paperwork. "Daniel," Richard said enthusiastically, "I just finished speaking with the board. They cannot stop talking about your leadership plan. Several investors specifically requested to meet you after the announcement. Congratulations again. This company is entering its strongest chapter because of your vision." I thanked him and ended the call. When I looked up, Olivia was still standing there in complete silence. She seemed to be seeing me through entirely different eyes. Not because of the title or the promotion itself, but because she had suddenly realized how much of my life had continued moving forward without her attention. She quietly sat down across from me. "I did not know any of this," she whispered. "I know," I answered gently. "You never asked?" Those 4 words landed much harder than any accusation ever could. There was no anger in my voice. only simple truth. For the first time since she had left for Christmas, Olivia began to understand that the distance between us had not appeared during one holiday weekend. It had been growing silently for a very long time, hidden beneath ordinary days that neither of us had fully understood until now. The days between Christmas and New Year's Eve passed with a quietness that felt unfamiliar inside our home. We moved around each other respectfully, speaking when necessary but never pretending that everything had returned to normal. One evening Olivia found me in the kitchen preparing dinner, something I had always enjoyed because cooking gave me time to think. She stood in the doorway for several seconds before finally saying, "Can we talk?" I set the knife down, turned off the stove, and nodded toward the dining table. We sat across from each other exactly where we had shared hundreds of meals over the years. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Olivia took a slow breath. "I have been thinking ever since I came home." I waited quietly. "I keep replaying everything that happened before Christmas. I expected you to stop me. I expected you to argue. I thought your silence meant you did not care anymore." I looked at her calmly. "My silence meant I was tired." She blinked, surprised by how quickly I answered. "Tired? Tired of believing that I always had to convince the person I married to choose me." She lowered her eyes. I continued speaking in the same steady voice I had used throughout our conversation. "Do you know what hurt the most? It was not that you visited someone from your past. It was that you made the decision without ever asking how I felt. You had already decided my place in your Christmas before we even had a conversation." Tears began forming in her eyes, but I continued without anger. "Over the past 2 years I slowly became someone you expected to understand everything. If you canceled plans, I understood. If work became stressful, I understood. If you forgot something important to me, I understood. Eventually understanding became the only thing you expected from me." She quietly wiped away a tear. "I never wanted to make you feel invisible." "I believe that," I answered honestly. "But intentions do not erase patterns." She looked up at me with an expression I had not seen in a long time. There was no defensiveness left. Only regret. "I thought we had become comfortable together," she admitted. "I did not realize comfortable had turned into taking you for granted." Those words hung between us for several seconds. I appreciated her honesty because it was the first completely honest conversation we had shared in months. "When you left," I said softly, "something became very clear to me. I realized I had spent years trying to become someone you would never leave, instead of asking whether I was with someone who truly wanted to stay." Olivia reached across the table but stopped before touching my hand. "I do want to stay." I nodded slowly. "Maybe you do now." She closed her eyes for a moment. "Daniel, I know I made a terrible mistake. I know I hurt you. But people make mistakes. We can fix this." I remained silent for several seconds before answering. "Mistakes can absolutely be repaired. But only after both people admit what was really broken," she whispered. "Then tell me." I looked around the room, at the Christmas decorations that would soon be packed away for another year. What broke was not Christmas. What broke was the feeling that our marriage was the safest place either of us could be. The day you decided another family deserved your holiday more than the one we were building together, you unknowingly showed me where I stood in your priorities. I cannot forget that simply because the calendar moved forward. She finally let the tears fall without trying to hide them. Yet even then I did not feel satisfaction. I felt sadness for both of us because I could finally see that neither of us had lost our marriage during one conversation. We had lost it one overlooked choice at a time until one ordinary December evening revealed what had been quietly growing beneath the surface all along. New Year's Eve arrived with freezing temperatures and clear skies, but inside our house the atmosphere remained calm rather than tense. Neither of us attended parties that year. We stayed home, quietly packing away Christmas decorations that only a week earlier had represented the life we believed we were building together. Every ornament seemed to carry a memory, yet instead of bringing comfort they reminded me how easily meaningful traditions could continue while emotional distance quietly grew beneath them. Olivia carefully wrapped the last glass ornament in tissue paper before placing it inside the storage box. She looked at me and asked softly, "Is there anything I can do to make you believe me?" I rested my hands on the edge of the box and answered with complete honesty. "I already believe you. I believe you regret what happened. I believe you wish you had made a different choice. What I do not know is whether regret alone can rebuild what trust used to be." She nodded slowly, accepting the difference between those two ideas. For several minutes we worked in silence before she spoke again. "I keep thinking about that day. If I could go back, I would never leave." I smiled gently. "I know." She looked confused by my answer. "Then why does it feel like you are already gone?" I took a deep breath before responding. "Because something changed inside me while you were away. Not because I stopped loving you, but because I finally started respecting myself enough to admit how lonely I had become inside our marriage." She quietly sat down on the couch, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the Christmas tree had stood. "I never realized you felt that alone. That is exactly the problem," I replied. "You never realized it because I spent years protecting you from my disappointment. Every time something hurt, I convinced myself it was not important enough to mention. Eventually there was so much left unsaid that neither of us recognized the marriage we were living in anymore." She covered her face with both hands for a moment before looking back at me. "I wish you had told me sooner. I wish I had too." Those words surprised even me because they were completely true. I had spent so much time blaming myself for staying quiet that I had almost forgotten communication required two people willing to notice each other. The following Monday morning I drove to the office to sign the final paperwork for my new position. As I sat in the conference room reviewing contracts, I realized this was the first major milestone of my adult life that did not feel connected to proving anything to someone else. I was simply grateful for the opportunity and proud of the years of steady work that had led there. When I returned home that evening, Olivia was waiting at the dining table. A single envelope rested beside her. "I met with a counselor today," she said. "I wanted to understand how I stopped seeing the person who was standing right in front of me every day." I listened quietly. "The counselor asked me one question that I could not answer," she continued. "She asked when I stopped treating my husband like the most important relationship in my life. I realized I did not know." I slowly sat across from her. The envelope contained handwritten pages describing everything she believed she had taken for granted throughout our marriage. There were no excuses, no attempts to shift blame, only honest reflection. I appreciated every word because they showed genuine effort. After reading the final page, I carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "This means more than you probably realize." Hope briefly returned to her expression. "Does that mean we still have a chance?" I looked into her eyes for a long moment before answering as gently as I could. "It means I finally believe you understand what happened. But understanding why something broke is not always the same as being able to restore it. Sometimes the bravest thing two people can do is tell each other the truth before pretending becomes the only thing holding them together." 1 year later Christmas arrived again, carrying the same cold air, familiar songs, and glowing lights that had once marked the beginning of the hardest season of my life. Yet almost everything else had changed. My new position had challenged me in ways I never imagined, but it had also reminded me that confidence grows quietly through consistent effort rather than dramatic moments. I had built an exceptional leadership team, earned the respect of people I admired, and discovered that success felt far more meaningful when it was shared with people who genuinely celebrated it. More importantly, I had learned to stop measuring my worth through someone else's ability to recognize it. Looking back, that lesson had become the greatest gift the previous Christmas ever gave me. Olivia and I had spent months talking honestly after New Year's Day. We attended counseling together, listened more carefully than we ever had before, and admitted painful truths that both of us had avoided for years. In the end, we reached the same conclusion with kindness instead of resentment. Love had existed between us, but our marriage had slowly lost the mutual care and attention that love required to survive. We chose to separate respectfully rather than continue pretending that hope alone could rebuild what neither of us had protected when we still had the chance. The process was quiet, thoughtful, and free from bitterness. We wished each other well because neither of us wanted the other to become the villain in a story that was ultimately about two people who had stopped noticing each other. A few weeks before Christmas, I received a handwritten card from Olivia. She thanked me for treating her with dignity even during the most difficult conversations of our lives. She wrote that counseling had changed the way she viewed relationships, responsibility, and everyday choices. She admitted that the sentence she regretted most was not spoken during our final conversations, but on the afternoon she assumed I would always accept being placed second. I read her letter twice before carefully placing it inside a drawer with other meaningful memories. Some chapters deserve gratitude even when they are over. On Christmas Eve, I drove once again to my parents' house. My father still insisted on hanging the lights himself. My mother still baked enough desserts to feed twice the number of people who actually arrived. Emily's children had grown another year taller, and immediately pulled me outside to help build a snowman before dinner. Standing in that familiar yard, I realized I was smiling without effort. Nothing about that happiness felt loud or dramatic. It came from the simple comfort of knowing I was surrounded by people who never made me wonder whether I belong. Later that evening, my father handed me a mug of hot chocolate and quietly asked, "How are you doing, son?" I looked around the room at my family laughing together before answering, "Better than I ever expected." He smiled because he understood exactly what I meant. Healing had not happened the day my marriage ended. It had happened one honest decision at a time. As midnight approached and another Christmas quietly settled into memory, I thought about how differently my life might have unfolded if I had argued that night instead of saying those two calm words. Perhaps nothing would have changed except that the truth would have arrived a little later. Sometimes peace does not come from winning someone back. Sometimes it comes from finally choosing yourself without anger, without revenge, and without forgetting the kindness that made you who you are. If there is one lesson I carry into every Christmas now, it is this. The people who truly love you will never ask you to compete for a place in their life. And the moment you begin believing you deserve to be chosen with the same certainty that you choose others, your future quietly begins to change in ways you never thought possible.